With the December 4th banned and restricted announcement behind us and everyone still maybe in shock and awe and excitement about the changes coming to various formats that they play, I wanted to dedicate a specific video to the Pauper changes. With one of the most accessible and fun formats out there, I think it's important to give credit to Gavin and the Pauper format panel for making the content and the videos that they do, and I'll be linking the article that they posted along with the video that we're going to be discussing today in the description down below. But I wanted to go over the video that they posted in 4 specific sections and just highlight them and really bring to light why they made this decision, and maybe talk about why I think it may not be the completely correct decision, but ultimately why I understand certain things need to change, and provide some further context for a player that's been honestly in and out of the format for the better part of 5 to 6 years at this point. So for those of you that are maybe newer, you can get some more understanding as to how the format has evolved. Now let's hop right into it with the very first section that I want to talk about here, and that's going to be, well, the section about the Swiftspear ban. Let's go for it.
Leagues where the vast majority of Pauper is played. We'll start with Mono Red, the most avidly requested deck we banned from, and the one we banned a card from today. Well, for a deck that people love to talk about, it might shock you to learn that its non-mirror win rate is 50.8%, barely over half its games.
So they're going to touch on this in a second, but I'm actually not surprised with how much burn has been in the Pauper format. Of course, everyone has a million different answers, whether it be removal, counter magic, or just life gain, which is surprisingly less popular than it was previously. I guess removal is generally the king based on how much of a mid-range deck this deck has become in response to these win rates. But let's keep going.
And that's from the best performing lists. Some versions of the deck hit sub 50% win rates. So why ban a card from it then? Well, once again, it's with the polarity. When you look at game 1, Mono Red does great. It is favored in the majority of its matchups. But in games 2 and 3, it changes to unfavored in almost all of its matchups.
Again, that makes sense because a lot of times you just have to keep hands that work for you. Pauper is it's a format of engines. You want to have and keep the advantage that you're able to attain, not have to answer burn every single game. So if you have your game plan laid out and it doesn't necessarily beat burn, that's fine. But in game 2 and 3, you mulligan to your removal, your first Hydro Blast, or your first piece of life game, whether it be like a Lembas or something, and you kind of just roll with it. And that makes more sense in that. So I think like there is a bigger discussion to be had as we see kind of later in the video, but I want to go over some of the elements here specifically. So Monastery Swiftspear is gone out of the format, and Gavin and the team later discuss in that video about how the card itself is very polarizing. When you have multiple copies, it can create very explosive turns, and it feels like you're so far behind when it comes to answering multiple copies of this card. The turn 1 play of this is always very frustrating to beat, but it is one of the more powerful things that deck can do. So it's had to have done it for a very long time, and it's what's given the deck its staying power, especially with the way that it's kind of dodged removal in this format. But the replacement that they kind of cited was the, well, Goblin Tomb Raider, the make your own goblin a goblin guide in many ways, where if you play a turn 1 artifact, red artifact land, Great Furnace, then this is going to come down as a 1 mana 2/2 with haste, which is fine. And I think with the bushwhacker builds of thing that they talk about as well, these tend to lead to the more lethal turns with bushwhackers, but it's also the more vulnerable turns where they go wide, but if you counter the bushwhacker, they're not doing much. And then if you have like an instant speed board wipe or something, then they also lose to that as well, because the toughness of these creatures don't change. They're still X ones, and so this is still relatively easy to answer, whereas something like a Swiftspear becomes like a 2/3, a 3/4. It's very hard to remove with, well, -2/-2 or -X/-X base removal, which is actually a relatively common form of removal, alongside red mirror removal, where you're just casting Galvanic Blast and Lightning Bolts at them. Getting ahead of 3 is relatively easy in the late game. If you top deck a Bolt, you just need 2 spells from your opponent to get past the 3 damage that a Lightning Bolt does. And who knows if you even have enough artifacts for a Galvanic Blast, because a lot of times you're just sacking them and throwing them away to do as much as you can in that moment. So it's nice that the Bushwhacker is there, or the Bushwhacker plan is being pushed, because this makes red more answerable. And I think what they were talking about in terms of bringing in you know, I guess having to devote so many sideboard cards to burn is good, because now that their power level is being reduced, you can just bring in some removal, a little bit of life gain, and you don't need to jam 4 Hydro Blasts, 4 Red Elemental Blasts, or Blue Elemental Blasts, and that's how you beat burn. You have more sideboard slots, which is going to be more relevant for a deck that we're going to talk about later. But it's nice to see that a card like this is going to see a lot less play, and sideboards are going to be more diverse, which gives more breathing room to other decks that want to bring itself into the metagame, because then your opponent has to work harder in their main board or in their mulliganing to answer you in that diversity. Now, I do see a lot less life gain in the format. I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite cards of all time, Feed the Clan in Pauper. Leave a comment down below if you were playing Pauper at the time when this card was good. I will give you a hint as to where it was played in a deck that played Carapace Forger, and if you can guess the deck, bonus points to you. But the Feed the Clan aspect of life gain against burn has been going down just because of how many, I guess, mid-range decks have been coming out in the red sphere. Decks have so much more mid-game plan now, with all the kind of exile the top 2 cards of your library and cast them until the end of your next turn type of thing going on. There's a lot more staying power, a lot more continuity and card advantage that the decks can produce. So it's about the long game and not necessarily about beating one giant swing. But Feed the Clan, regardless, 10 life was so good against the burn decks back then. But again, leave a comment section down below. Leave a comment in the comment section down below if you know and can link me a list to which Feed the Clan was a solid sideboard card. But speaking of robots, the next section, talk about
starting with Affinity.
Affinity
has been playable in Pauper for a very long time.
Yes, it has.
Resilient to bans like ATOG and picked up new toys along the way. Most recently, All That Glitters gave the deck a whole new spin with a blue-white version that can slap it on an Ornithopter or Ginger Brute and hit hard out of nowhere. We talked for a long time about bans here, and there were 2 main directions to go. The first and simple one is just All That Glitters. It's the recent downshift that enables this deck to hit so hard, and part of what can make games polar. However, it is pretty easy to disrupt as just an aura that sits on a creature. The second,
a lot of enchantment removal,
is a set of artifact lands, either the 10 bridges or the 5 original Mirrodin artifact lands.
So I'm going to stop it right here. I think Gavin brings up great context later on as well, but I want to add my own spin to it. So Affinity has been along for a while. Let's walk through some of the many versions of Affinity that has existed in the format. And I've been playing these for a while. I have all of these in a deck somewhere, because I feel like it's like a collecting thing at this point, the different versions of Affinity. So first of all, we have an ATOG Fling version, and this one is kind of transient in many ways. So you just sacrifice a bunch of your artifacts and then you cast Fling to deal a bunch of damage at your opponent. This is a time when Counterspell was not legal in the format. You had a lot less options to what your opponent was going to do to you, or sorry, I guess more so just like good counterspells in general were just not a thing. The format was all about aggression, maybe a little bit of mid-range. It's damage based removal versus interaction on the stack, which is what the kind of format was working with. Then there was the Disciple of the Vault era, which was kind of an evolution of the Fling nonsense, where as the format evolved, you still had Fling in some variants of the Disciple decks, but this was definitely one of the versions that was very, very polarizing. You did a lot of damage on the way out, so especially with an ATOG legal, you would sacrifice a bunch of your artifacts and your opponents would lose a bunch of life that way, and then you could probably just go in with a swing if your Fling got countered. That was a frustrating thing. So the Disciple allowed these turns where, like, heck, if you did not have removal, if you just had counter magic, how do you deal with the Disciple? And then if you didn't have counter magic and you dealt with the removal, well, how many pieces of removal did you have to deal with all this fling? You could just fling things in response to the removal. So Disciple was very polarizing, along with cards like Chromatic Sphere, being able to just sack it on the way out. Now we're kind of in our Deadly Dispute era with the Grixis Affinity list, where it's all about card advantage and just playing cards out, recurring things, returning them from the graveyard, and just playing good threats, interacting a little bit as well. And then finally, the mentioned All That Glitters version, where you're just going super heavy. You put it on a flying creature and you just swing over top, beat your opponent in the air or whatever it might be, even on the ground. You don't need combat tricks when your creatures are like 15/15s. But with all that in mind, I think an important discussion has to be had along with the artifact lands, and this is mentioned in the video. Full stop. I don't think these cards should be banned at all. And I think there's a very good discussion, very good article that I'm going to link below in the comment section down below from one of the members of the Pauper panel, Alex Ullman, talking about engines in Pauper. And I think these bring identity to the format. Having power in your format is very important. You need to make sure that players are able to do powerful things. This is kind of the reason why formats like Pioneer don't appeal to a lot of people, but do more so as more formats come in. And we have combo decks like the Discover deck, which is now banned, but we have more attraction to formats when players can do powerful things similar to what they're doing in other formats. So Great Furnace, obviously banned in the modern format, but then we also have the tapped artifact lands, which, you know, we'll talk about fetch lands in a second. I thought an image of the tap lands, but the Great Furnace part of it is kind of similar to the fetch lands, which is what I wanted to bring up. Now, let me know in the comment section down below if you believe that fetch lands are the most broken cycle ever printed in Magic's history. And for those of you relatively newer to Magic, you may not understand why. Why would searching for any land or any mana or whatever color, fixing your mana, why would that be busted? Well, you have to imagine that formats like Vintage, Legacy, Modern, and any format that has it, any arena format that's soon going to have it, that's a whole other video tomorrow, is warped around these cards. Perfect mana bases and access to different colors is very important for the colors that you want to build your deck around. The spells that you have access to, the answers that you have access to, is built around the fetch lands, and that's very important for artifact lands. This gives you the ability to cast Galvanic Blast, cards that require artifacts to make them cheaper, or just the ability to sacrifice certain lands for benefits. These cards are very important to the Pauper format as enablers, and again, just having that power level, having that polarizing aspect, giving players an advantage for playing these lands outside of just being tap lands or gates in the Cog Gates deck. It's very important to have these kind of analog fetch lands where you're not fixing your mana base, but they kind of act like, well, for the Affinity deck at least, little rituals essentially. You play it as a land, they discount your artifact spells, and then they tap for a mana. They're kind of mini rituals. And so it's important to make sure that players can do powerful things. Even if they're busted, you have to fix around them, make them tapped if they're two colors, have very efficient artifact hate in the format. Remember Gorilla Shaman, which was a very popular 4-of sideboard staple for much of the Pauper format? It's always there. It's always available as an answer. If you want to beat the Affinity decks, if Affinity becomes uncontrollable, there are answers to the deck, which is why we don't need to be actively banning these cards. And I do understand my bias here as a very much like, I love the Affinity deck itself, but I think comparing them to the fetch lands in terms of the power level that they provide in Pauper is fair, because a lot of decks use them, a lot of decks need them as an engine, and a lot of decks go to answer them. But of course, they're not as ubiquitous, which is fine. They're not equal to the fetch lines at all, but they're analogous. They're similar in power levels and in terms of what they provide to the format in general and how they warp around it. Don't ban them, work around them, and give players the ability to do powerful things for the 5th and final time or whatever. But yeah, that is very important. But speaking on doing powerful things, giving players access to things, making things easier to do.
Down below. Finally,
let's talk about the terror in the format.
I want to talk about Terror. This deck has been blue-black for a long time, and its win rate was never anything wild. However, the addition of Cryptic Serpent with the Commander Master,
I think that's normal with many kind of control decks.
Just seeks to drop these huge creatures into play quickly. We talked about banning a couple options here. The first was just Terror or Serpent themselves, as big threats that came down cheaply and were tough to kill. The second is a spell, the card we most discussed being Lorien Revealed.
Now, Lorien Revealed, I don't really want to touch on. I think the video goes over it fair enough, but I want to focus specifically on the lack of bans coming out of this deck. I think Lorien Revealed in general is fine. I think fixing your mana is okay, and just having draw 3 at the top end. This is a very divisive card, especially in Legacy and Vintage, being brought up in the banned and restricted article there. So you can tell how far it's being brought up there, but without the ability to search for like duels or search for specific island subtype cards, it's not as busted as you might think in the Pauper format. So I think it's fine here. But what I want to talk about is the creatures themselves. In many ways, the Tolarian Terror deck, the Dimir Terror, or just the mono blue Delver deck that plays Terror as well, they aren't necessarily control decks. They're kind of tempo decks. They're kind of closer to is it Murktide in modern versus, you know, Azorius Control in modern, where you play out a threat that's very cheap with a build your own Dark Ritual. And Dark Ritual, for those of you unaware, 1 black for 3 black mana, so you kind of pay 1 to get back 2 more. Whereas this card, Thought Scour, it goes to the graveyard and then you mill yourself for 2, so you add 2 more cards to your graveyard. So in many ways you add, you know, kind of 3 cards to your graveyard if they all happen to be instant and sorcery. So again, for the cost reduction, it's a build your own Dark Ritual for a Tolarian Terror. And I think the real problem is the amount of counter magic in the format. I think that is what people fear. They have a really hard time resolving the spells that they want, which I think is important. You need to have policing in the format, which is why Legacy and Vintage are called classics. Vintage if it was more accessible, but Legacy very much so, where you have decks like Blue Soups that have Force of Wills and Dazes all over, because the formats have really busted things that they want to do, and you need to have stoppages for those. You need to be able to have something that can police those, that can say, if you want to go off, I need to have an answer to stop you, or if I want to go off on some crazy combo, you know, my opponent has to be able to do something just as equally fair to stop me. And so Counterspell is the most kind of fair way to do that. And Counterspell is very accessible in this format. It's actually relatively easy to get blue and many other colors, as we see, or have advantages with mono blue, or very easily with a secondary splash. So with the amount of Counterspell in the format, I think also the problem is the amount of cheap interaction that also exists on the stack. Now, my bias is with my 1-land spy decks. It's very hard to play combo in this format, which again, I think is okay. I think that's okay, and I have to be okay with that. Many other combo players have to be okay with that, because the minute combo becomes busted, then something else needs to be banned. You'll notice that much of the banned and restricted list for this format is based around combos generating more mana, generating infinite mana. That is what is based around. So I think Balustrade Spy and really the 1-land spy decks gaining more power recently out of the Tales of Middle-earth decks, that's fine. That is great. I just wish there was a little bit less counter magic in the format, but I get it. There can't be, for the sake of counter magic or sake of combo decks. Now, they cited a big win in the form of Tithing Blade. Now, Tithing Blade, I think, is very important. If I can just find it here, Tithing Blade is very important as a interaction piece against the blue decks. And specifically, if we look at the ability to recur an edict, where Tithing Blade in an Orzhov bounce list comes down, your opponent sacrifice a creature, each opponent notably, so it gets around hexproof effects, each opponent sacrifices your creature. Then what you can do is you can bounce it with a Glinthawk, play it again. So recurable, cheap interaction against the terror decks is very important, and they've cited that these decks have been a good answer to them, which I think is great too. With the sideboard slots of red being opened up, not as many people are playing Blue Elemental Blast or Hydro Blast. I think more sideboard slots being dedicated to the counter magic decks, or decks that are playing Tithing Blade or whatever, and especially with the craft, with the creature on the other side, creating a long game engine where each opponent loses 1 life each turn. I think stuff like this is really important for the format, and I actually want to see how this evolves. If this leads to more, kind of less of this nonsense with all of these blue soups happening, I am all for it. But specifically, can we just, outside of Tithing Blade and just the, kind of long in this place, can we just get rid of like Spell Pierce, or like, what Spell Pierce is fine, Force Spike. Truly's Force Spike. It's the Mana Tithe problem where you have to pay 1. I hate getting got by Force Spike. Mana Tithe, if you get got by, it sucks, but if your opponent has Mana Tithe, oh well. But Force Spike, oh, the amount of times this card has frustrated me. Spell Pierce is one thing, Counterspell is one thing, but Force Spike? I get it. It doesn't need to be banned, but come on. Come on. Last card that I want to mention
finally
has to do with stickers.
Card Blank Goblin, or Name Sticker Goblin, on Magic Online. Though the Magic Online team at Daybreak has done great work to implement this card on
they really
Magic
have
Online, there have been
with the limitations of the Magic Online
this works differently in
client
life and online to be a strange split for the format. It has mostly shown up some in the format alongside Monastery Swiftspear, which is now banned. We're going to keep an eye on this, and we're not afraid to ban it if at any point it does become a substantial issue and disconnect between formats.
And I think that's very important because it's great to try things out. The name sticker aspect, for those of you who don't know, the original printing of this card, which we'll kind of show later on, required you to play an Unfinity mechanic, which wasn't really implementable, if that's a word, on Magic Online due to the limitations of the system. So they had to go with another unique aspect. And largely speaking, you pay 3 mana and you're always going to get at least 1 more mana. You're going to pay 3 for 4, 3 for 5, or 3 for 6, depending on what you roll. But regardless, you will always be up on mana with this card, which is generally okay. That's the purpose of it. But this is more deterministic in many ways from what people have said based on how the sticker implementation works. And notably for me, again, that one land spy version of things that I play, I'm going to shout out the Epic Storm and Brian from there, playing a name sticker version, where this is allowing certain combo decks to be a little bit more deterministic, a great other option. But I think ultimately the name sticker version isn't better than the version out right now, but it gives option to decks like this. And it's important to understand that implementation of mechanics like this is important. It's great to see people try, but of course, if a disconnect is made where a card like this becomes very busted, I'm happy to hear that the Pauper format panel is okay with banning them. They are watching cards like this. They are very aware of cards like this. And I'm happy that a format panel like this exists for this format. For such an accessible format, it's nice to see that these things are being implemented, they are being watched, and although they are being played and they may be broken one day, there is a hope that they will be banned, they will be removed, and there still are many other options, many other rituals that are still legal in the Pauper format that can do just as well. But ultimately, what I'm looking forward to, honestly, with the lack of burn in the format, playing a little bit more one land spy, or not one land spy, Turbo Fog with Stream of Thought. Sorry, I am definitely looking forward to playing one land spy. If blue's going to see a big downswing, burn going is tough because burn was definitely one of the better matchups, I think, but with hopefully a lot less blue, maybe one land spy, but a little bit of Turbo Fog, I'm happy, because burn was one of the tougher matchups for it, and you can generally work around counter magic pretty well because you have a lot of mana, you can cast a lot of like fogs, so generally this is okay. You can replicate this a bunch as well, but let me know what you think in the comment section down below. This did end up being a longer video, a lot of thoughts coming out, but let me know what you think is happening with the Pauper format. What deck are you looking forward to play? Are you going to be jamming some black green gardens with Tightening Blade, some Orzhov bounce, some mono blue to force some more counter magic now that the blue menace or the red menace is gone? Let me know all down below, and I hope to find you across the table in the leagues coming soon.